The basement of Whitmore and Price in the summer of 1974 was the kind of place sunlight never thought about touching. Even on the brightest afternoon in downtown Chicago, the room remained an island of half-lit shadows and humming fluorescent tubes that flickered as though unsure whether they wanted to stay alive. Dust drifted in the stale air like tiny ghosts, rising with every footstep on the aging linoleum floor. Metal filing cabinets stood in long rows, stern, silent, and heavy with secrets, forming corridors narrower than a confession booth. It was a maze only one person ever truly knew how to navigate. Eleanor Hayes sat in the middle of it, her posture straight despite hours of typing, her fingers dancing with a measured, unhurried grace over the keys of her Remington typewriter. That machine was older than half the attorneys who worked upstairs. Its paint chipped, its metal scratched, its keys slightly worn down by time and work, but it sounded like music when she used it. A crisp, rhythmic clacking echoed off the low ceiling, each keystroke confident and precise. She didn't type the way others did. She typed as though she were stitching something delicate, or as though the words she pressed into paper needed to be anchored to the world with care. Outside the archive room, the law firm bustled with ringing phones, urgent footsteps, and the sound of legal jargon tossed like weapons. But down here, Eleanor existed in a different world. One that moved according to her breath, her fingertips, the long exhale she gave when finishing each page. She liked it this way. She liked the quiet. It allowed her to remember. The basement had a smell she'd grown used to. Ink, cardboard, the faint trace of mildew that clung to records from decades ago. She had been 29 when she'd first walked into this room, carrying a box of sharpened pencils, a fresh ribbon for the Remington, and a determination to make a place for herself. When she began, she had no idea that this room would keep more of her life than the apartment she returned to each night. She knew the hum of the fluorescent lights better than she knew the sound of her own refrigerator. She recognized the weight of the filing cabinets better than the weight of the coats hanging in her own closet. But she didn't regret it. Not then. Not now. On this particular afternoon, hot, heavy, and restless, the archive door swung open with unusual force, breaking the calm of the room. Eleanor looked up from her typewriter, her fingers frozen above the keys. Thomas Culver, one of the firm's senior attorneys, strode in with a face carved from tension. His jacket hung open, tie loosened, his usually neat appearance disheveled. His eyes darted toward the stairs as though terrified someone had followed him. Then to Eleanor, who watched him with a stillness that could draw a confession from a man without a word. "Close the door," he whispered. She didn't ask why. She simply rose, walked to the door, and shut it quietly. The latch clicked shut, sealing them into the dim archive room. Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice even more. "Eleanor, I need your help." Those were words she heard often, though never spoken with this kind of dread. She waited for him to continue. Without ceremony, he dropped a battered manila folder onto her desk. It slid across the surface, stopping just short of her typewriter. Her eyes scanned the label. There wasn't one. No markings. No date. No case number. "Open it," he urged. Inside the folder were papers, thick, official, heavy with ink and implication. Eleanor read quickly but absorbed every word. It was a memorandum addressed to the Illinois Corporate Oversight Committee. Attached were several handwritten notes and supporting documents, a ledger, a sworn statement, and a signature she recognized even without reading it twice. Her breath caught at the name, Arthur Whitmore, the founding partner, the man whose portrait hung in the lobby, the father of Charles Whitmore, the rising executive everyone upstairs whispered about with admiration and fear. She read the memo again. Financial fraud, undisclosed partnerships, intentional misrepresentation. Her heart hammered once, sharply. "This is real?" she asked. Thomas dragged a hand through his hair. "It's more than real. It's a loaded gun." Eleanor didn't speak. "If this memo goes missing," he continued, "everything collapses. Our credibility, our reputation, the entire firm, Arthur's legacy, all of it turns to ash." She looked at him, really looked, and understood the unspoken fear. This wasn't just about the firm. This was about survival, about what powerful people do when cornered. She had seen enough to know that justice in this building was often the first casualty. "What do you need me to do?" she asked softly. Thomas exhaled shakily, relieved she hadn't refused. "I need you to type an official reproduction. A clean copy. Something crisp enough to hold up under scrutiny. The original stays as evidence. But someone wants this gone. And if it disappears, we need proof it once existed." He swallowed hard. "And Eleanor, hide the copy. Hide it somewhere no one will think to look." She understood immediately. Others typed fast and sloppy, or left carbon smudges, or misplaced pages. Eleanor's work was unmistakable. Perfect alignment, clean ink, flawless spacing. If she typed a document, it bore her signature precision. It became a thing that could not be denied. She pulled the Remington closer. "Let me read it once more," she murmured. She read each sentence, each accusation, each detail that threatened to unmake the powerful. And then, with a steadying breath, she fed the first sheet of paper into the typewriter. Her fingers began to move. As she typed, the keys sang out, striking the inked ribbon with authority. Each character appeared on the page like a truth pressed into stone. Thomas paced behind her, stopping occasionally to glance toward the door. Sweat glistened at his temples. He knew what he had brought into this room. He knew whose wrath might follow, and the thought made his steps uneven. After several minutes, he stopped and watched her truly. The calm that she radiated, the absolute lack of panic, grounded him in a way he hadn't expected. "You're not afraid," he said quietly. Eleanor didn't pause her typing. "Fear makes hands shake. Shaking makes mistakes. I don't make mistakes." She finished the first page, removed it, set it aside, and began the next without hesitation. Thomas let out a faint, incredulous laugh, rubbing his jaw. "I always wondered how you do it, how you stay so steady. When you work with other people's secrets long enough," she replied. "You learn to slow your heart before it outruns your head." When she finished the entire memo, she slid the completed pages into a fresh folder. She labeled it exactly as the original should have been labeled, her handwriting small and neat. Then she took the original memo and tucked it carefully inside the official archive box labeled 1974, Internal Affairs, sliding it between hundreds of other folders that looked nearly identical. Thomas watched her. "You're making it blend in." "No," she corrected softly. "I'm putting it where it always belonged. If anyone comes looking for it, they'll never find it without me." "And the copy?" he asked. She rose, taking the unmarked reproduction, and walked down a narrow aisle to row 17. She climbed a metal step stool, reached toward the highest shelf, and slid the folder into an old dusty box with no label. The kind of box no one touched. The kind of box only she knew existed. Once she returned to her desk, Thomas exhaled a breath that trembled at the edges. "Thank you, Eleanor," he whispered. "You might have saved us." She didn't smile. Some truths weren't for smiling. "What happens now?" she asked. Thomas hesitated. "The investigative committee will decide whether to pursue this. And Arthur, well, he'll deny everything. He has influence. Friends in powerful places." She nodded. She had expected as much. "Be careful," she said. He blinked. "Me?" She looked him straight in the eye. "You don't bring a truth like this into the light without someone trying to put you in the dark." For a moment, Thomas looked at her as though seeing not just a typist, but the single most dangerous person in the building. The one who knew where all the bodies were buried, and who had the memory to find any bone in the graveyard. But when he left, she didn't feel powerful. She felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. The investigation came and went. Mysteriously, nothing happened. Files were misplaced. Witnesses withdrew. Phone calls were made behind closed doors. Arthur Whitmore's reputation remained pristine. In the weeks that followed, the original memo and its copy sat in their respective resting places, silent as held breath. Eleanor never mentioned it. Thomas never spoke of it again. But she noticed the way he sometimes passed her in the hallway with a tight, worried nod, or the way he occasionally checked over his shoulder as he walked into meetings. Some truths didn't die. They waited. Years passed. 5, 10, 20. Attorneys came and went. Secretaries typed and retired. Technology crept into the building. Computers, scanners, servers. But Eleanor remained with her Remington. She became part of the firm's mythology. The woman who knew every case, every file, every storage aisle. Partners trusted her memory more than they trusted the new machines. Sometimes young associates asked her why she never moved upstairs, or why she didn't learn to use the digital systems. She always smiled politely and said, "The basement keeps me busy." They laughed, assuming it was a joke. They didn't know the truth, that she had once stored a secret down here so heavy that the walls might crack if it was ever unearthed. By the late 1990s, Arthur Whitmore died, leaving the firm to his only son, Charles. The man was ambitious, ruthless, and molded by the legacy he thought unblemished. He rose through the ranks, molding the firm in his image, sleek, modern, unforgiving. Eleanor watched silently from the basement as he built an empire on the foundation Arthur had laid. She wondered sometimes if he knew, if his father ever confessed, if he ever stumbled across something that made him question the portrait that hung in the lobby. Arthur's portrait, smiling with confidence, the frame polished weakly as though worshipped. But Charles never looked down. Not at the basement, not at her, not at anything that lived in the shadows. As the decades rolled forward, Eleanor aged with the building. Her hair silvered, her hands grew thinner but no less steady. Her shoulders rounded slightly, but her walk never lost its quiet purpose. She still typed, she still remembered, she still knew where every file lived, even the one no one else knew existed. By 2019, the firm was nearly unrecognizable: glass walls, touchscreen monitors, voice-activated conference rooms. Yet the basement archive remained stubbornly unchanged. A relic, an artifact, a place time forgot. Except one evening, long after most of the firm's employees had gone home, Eleanor lingered in the archive room, sorting through files from the 1980s. Outside, rain tapped against the building like impatient fingers. The storm made the lights flicker slightly. She paused to rest her eyes. She leaned back in her chair, listening to the hum of the room. Then, without warning, the lights brightened. Footsteps echoed from the stairwell, confident and fast. She recognized the stride instantly. Charles Whitmore. He descended the stairs like a man entering enemy territory. The basement felt smaller with him in it, as though his ambition filled the air and left little room for oxygen. He stepped into the archive room and halted when he saw her. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, forcing a smile that felt like a blade behind velvet. "Still down here with that machine, I see." She glanced at her Remington. "It hasn't failed me yet, Mr. Whitmore." "Perhaps," he said. "But times change. Expectations change. The firm is moving in a new direction. A more modern one." Her heart dipped, but her expression didn't. "You're planning layoffs." He gave a short, empty laugh. "You always were perceptive." She watched him patiently, waiting for him to speak the truth he was circling. "You've been here a long time," he said, "and we're grateful for your service. Truly. But we need efficiency. Employees who adapt. Systems that don't rely on memory but on data." She understood then. He didn't know what she remembered. He didn't even consider that she could. "You're letting me go," she said quietly. He nodded once, pleased she had made it easy for him. "You'll receive a generous severance package. And of course, we'll help you transition into retirement." Retirement. The word felt like a dismissal of her entire life. But Eleanor didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply rose, opened a drawer, and retrieved her worn leather case. Gently, she placed her typewriter inside. As she fastened the latch, Charles studied her with a detached curiosity, as though he had never seen her before and didn't particularly care what he saw now. "Good evening, Mrs. Hayes," he said, already turning to leave. And then he was gone, without a glance back at the room that had held half a century of her work. Eleanor walked out of the basement for what everyone at the firm assumed would be the last time. But as she reached the doorway, she turned back, just once, and looked at the rows of boxes. Row 17, top shelf, far right, a secret waited in the dark. She closed the door softly behind her. Outside, the rain intensified. The city glowed with neon and headlights, bustling and indifferent. Eleanor stepped into the night, her Remington case swinging gently at her side. She wondered how long it would take before someone realized what they had thrown away. She didn't have to wait long. For in less than 2 weeks, everything she had feared decades ago finally clawed its way back into the light, pulling the firm and Charles Whitmore into a storm far more violent than the one that drenched her as she walked home that night. And it all began with a single, panicked phone call in the middle of the night. The phone rang at 3:07 a.m. A shrill, metallic sound that sliced through the stillness of David Ross's apartment like a blade. He woke with a jolt, sheets twisted around him, heart racing in confusion as the ringing persisted. No one called at this hour, not unless something had gone terribly wrong. He fumbled for the phone, blinking sleep from his eyes. His screen lit up with the name of the firm's senior partner on call that week. Harold Quinn. The man who never panicked, never raised his voice, never lost his composure. If Harold was calling now at this ungodly hour, it meant the firm was standing at the edge of a cliff. David answered quickly. Ross speaking. Get to the office, Harold said, his voice tight, strained. Now, what happened? It's Whitmore, and a memo from... His voice dipped, as though afraid to speak too loudly even over the phone. Before David could ask more, Harold hung up. Adrenaline replaced whatever traces of fatigue remained. He threw on his clothes, grabbed his keys, and bolted into the cold darkness of early morning Chicago. Rain slicked the streets, street lamps glowing against puddles that rippled beneath passing cars. The entire city seemed tense, as if sensing the storm that was gathering around one law firm in particular. When David reached the office, the lobby lights were already on, bright, sterile, unforgiving. He stepped inside, shaking rain from his coat. The air was electric with urgency. Elevator doors slid open with a mechanical groan, and the moment they delivered him to the firm's floor, he saw movement everywhere. Associates ran between conference rooms, partners barked orders, paralegals gathered stacks of documents with trembling hands. It was chaos, but orchestrated chaos, the kind that came only from catastrophic stakes. Ross, over here. David turned to find Harold waving him into a glass-walled conference room. Inside, several attorneys were already assembled, faces pale, eyes wide. At the head of the table stood the man himself, Charles Whitmore. Only now, stripped of his usual polished confidence, he looked like a cornered animal. Sit, Harold instructed. David did. Charles slammed a folder onto the table. We're being sued, he said, breath ragged. A class action suit alleging fraud. An opposing counsel claims there's a memo from 1974 proving my father knew of irregularities and covered them up. David's mind sharpened instantly. The memo Eleanor had hidden. He didn't dare speak. Charles paced the room like a man trying to outrun his own bloodline. And worse, he continued. They told the judge during the emergency hearing tonight that we already produced this memo once, years ago, but can't produce it again. They're implying we destroyed evidence. Harold leaned forward. The judge gave us until this morning's session to provide the document. If we fail, it will be assumed we intentionally concealed it. And, Charles snapped, we lose. Everything. A suffocating silence wrapped around the room. Then, where is it? Charles demanded. Where the hell is this memo? Associates looked at each other helplessly. Partners fidgeted. Paralegals shifted weight from one foot to the other. No one knew. Or rather, no one dared say what they suspected. I checked the digital archives, Harold said. Nothing pre-1983 exists. And the physical archives from the 1970s, well, they're incomplete. Incomplete, Charles thundered. They were digitized. David spoke carefully. Sir, The basement archives weren't fully cataloged before digitization. Some boxes never made it into the system. And who would know about those boxes? Charles demanded. Harold's silence was an answer. David whispered the name before he could stop himself. Mrs. Hayes. The room froze. Whitmore's face darkened, contorted by bitterness and fear. The old woman? The typist? He spat the words, as though Eleanor were an enemy soldier rather than a former employee. She hoarded things, always insisting she knew better. She probably hid it. Sir, Harold began cautiously. Eleanor worked here for nearly 50 years. She was meticulous. She was obsolete, Charles growled. And I should have fired her years ago. David felt something in his chest tighten, anger sparking on Eleanor's behalf. But he bit his tongue. He was new. He needed his job. And there were bigger things at stake here than pride. We need that memo, Harold said. And we need it fast. Charles slammed both hands on the table. Find it. Tear apart the archives. I don't care how. Everyone stood, chairs scraping back in a dissonant chorus. They hurried out like ants driven from a burning nest. David stayed behind for a moment. Something in him whispered, quiet but insistent, that the answer wasn't in panic searching. It wasn't in frantic combing of random boxes. It wasn't even in the firm's half-baked digital systems. The answer was in the woman they'd discarded like trash. David took a breath, and with courage he wasn't sure he possessed, he said, I'll call her. Harold hesitated, then nodded. Do it. David slipped into the quiet hallway and dialed Eleanor's number. He prayed she still had the same landline. He prayed she would answer. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Hello? Came her voice, fragile and warm, yet fully awake, as though she had known this call would come someday. Mrs. Hayes, David said carefully. I know it's late. I'm sorry to wake you. You didn't wake me, she said simply. Some nights, the world feels restless. Tonight is one of those nights. He swallowed. The firm is in trouble. I figured, she murmured. The memo? David's heart thudded. You know where it is. I know where everything is, she replied. But the question is, should I help? He froze. He hadn't expected resistance. She had always seemed gentle, soft-spoken, but now he heard something else. Injury, betrayal, disappointment carved into her voice like old scars. Mrs. Hayes, he said. I know Mr. Whitmore treated you unfairly. Unfairly? She interjected, still calm. Is that what they're calling it now? He took a breath. If we don't produce that memo by morning, the firm will collapse. And you care about that? She asked, not unkindly but with piercing clarity. David leaned against the wall, staring at the tiles beneath his feet. I'm new. I don't have the power to change what happened to you. But I believe the truth should never be lost. Not for anyone's convenience. There was silence, then a soft sigh. I appreciate your honesty, she said. And your manners. David's shoulders relaxed slightly. It's on the top shelf of row 17, she continued. Far right. An unlabeled box. Handle it gently. And David? Yes, ma'am? Don't open it. Not there. Not with them watching. Her tone made his skin prickle. Why not? Because the truth inside that box, she whispered, is heavier than you think. He ended the call. His pulse hammered as he hurried down the stairs into the basement. The hall lights flickered as he passed, echoing the unease crawling up his spine. When he stepped into the archive room, the air felt colder than usual. The silence was absolute. No attorneys had reached the basement yet. He was alone. Row 17 stretched out like a nerve. Ancient cardboard boxes lined the shelves. Dust coated everything in a thin century-old sheen. David climbed the step stool. The metal creaked beneath him. Then he saw it. A plain, unlabeled box. The one Eleanor had described. His hands shook as he lifted it down. He placed it on a nearby table, staring at it for a long moment. The lid seemed to hold its breath. He opened it slowly. Inside was the memo, yellowed with age, edges crisp but fragile. and behind it, more pages. Handwritten notes, ledgers, a sworn statement, a signature he recognized from the framed portrait in the lobby. Arthur Whitmore. The truth hit him like a physical force. Arthur had committed fraud. He knew. He had covered it up. And Charles must have known too, or discovered it later and buried it deeper. David felt sick. His phone vibrated. A message from Harold, "We need it now. Bring whatever you find to the conference room immediately." David lifted the box. But as he turned toward the door, the fluorescent lights flickered violently, then steadied. A ripple of cold air brushed the back of his neck, like a warning. He realized something with chilling clarity. If Charles knew what this memo contained, if he understood the depth of his father's crime, he wouldn't let this evidence walk into the light without a fight. And now David was holding the kind of truth that ruined empires. He took a slow breath, clutching the box to his chest. Then he headed upstairs, unaware that the discovery in his hands would not only shake the firm, it would change the trajectory of his own life forever. As he stepped out of the archive room, dawn began to creep over the city, soft and muted. But the morning session in court would be anything but gentle. And the moment Eleanor's words echoed in his mind, "The truth inside that box is heavier than you think," he understood she hadn't warned him out of fear. She had warned him out of experience. David carried the box against his chest as if it contained a living thing. Fragile, dangerous, capable of changing its shape if he let his grip slip even slightly. The weight of it felt heavier with each step up the dim stairwell, as though the secrets inside had mass, as though the truth accumulated into something physical, something that pressed down on him more tightly the closer he got to the surface. His shoes hit the stairs with soft thuds, each one echoing into the emptiness like a warning. When he pushed open the stairwell door, the chaotic hum of the office returned in a rush of noise and motion. Associates scurried like startled birds. Partners barked out half-formed commands. Screens flickered with rapidly moving text. A printer jammed, shrieking in mechanical protest. And through all of it, panic pulsed like a heartbeat. David breathed in slowly. If anyone saw the box, questions would follow. Questions he couldn't answer honestly without igniting a firestorm before they were ready for it. He slid the box into his coat, holding it under one arm as though it were simply a stack of notes. The cardboard edges dug into his ribs, reminding him with every step, "You're holding an entire Dynasty skeleton." He walked toward the glass conference room, where figures moved in frantic silhouettes. Charles Whitmore stood at the center like a conductor holding together an unraveling orchestra. Only his movements were sharp, frantic, too rigid to be in control. He pointed at charts, slammed his hand on the table, gestured so violently that his cufflinks flashed under the ceiling lights. David paused outside the conference room, watching through the glass for a moment. Charles's face was taut, jaw clenched, eyes wild with the kind of fear powerful men tasted only rarely, when they realized something they couldn't outmaneuver had finally arrived. Harold noticed David through the glass and motioned sharply. David stepped inside. "Did you find anything?" Harold asked, voice low, urgent. David's throat tightened. The truth perched on the tip of his tongue, a heavy bird waiting to spread its wings. "I found something," he said. Charles's eyes snapped toward him. "Where?" "In the archives." "And?" David swallowed. "You asked for the memo." "It's here." He lifted the box just enough for Harold to see but kept the lid closed, kept the contents hidden. Instinct told him revealing the full truth in this room, under these lights, with this man present, was the wrong move. Eleanor's warning echoed in his ears, quiet but sharp. Not there. Not with them watching. Charles lunged forward, hand outstretched. "Give it to me." David stepped back before he realized he had moved. The action startled even him. Charles froze mid-step, eyes narrowing in suspicion and something more primal. Fear, perhaps, or the faint awareness that David now possessed something capable of destroying him. "It's delicate," David said quickly. "The paper is old. I don't want anything to tear." Harold nodded, buying time. "He's right, Charles. Let the kid handle it for now. We'll present it to the judge in an hour and—" "In an hour?" Charles cut in. My reputation might already be in pieces. I need to see what's inside that box. David forced his breath to steady. We should take it somewhere safe, somewhere controlled, not here. He gestured around the room, where frantic voices and clattering keyboards filled the air. This isn't the place. Charles stepped closer, his gaze drilling into David's. Are you hiding something? The moment stretched, taut as wire. No, David lied with steady eyes. But this memo is the key to our defense. If anything happens to it, if something spills, if someone bumps the table, we lose everything. Harold, sensing the tension, placed a firm hand on Charles's arm. Charles, let's handle this smartly. For a moment, Charles looked as though he might lash out, might rip the box away, might tear through the contents with his bare hands. But then, slowly, rationality returned to his features, or at least something shaped like rationality. Fine, he said through clenched teeth. But I'm coming with you. David nodded. Of course. Together, the two men stepped out of the conference room, leaving behind the chaos and noise. The hall felt colder, quieter. David led Charles toward one of the firm's small private meeting rooms. Rooms usually reserved for sensitive settlement discussions or quiet breakdowns after long trials. The kind of room where secrets were whispered and never recorded. Inside, the overhead light flickered on, illuminating a bare table, 2 chairs, and the sterile neutral-colored walls that seemed to absorb sound. David placed the box on the table with careful hands. He felt Charles's breath behind him, too close, too eager. Open it, Charles commanded. David lifted the lid. The memo lay on top, yellowed but immaculate, its typed letters crisp and damning. Below it were attached statements, scribbled ledger notes, a copy of the signature, Arthur Whitmore's unmistakable flourish, bold and confident. Now a ghostly accusation on aging paper. Charles reached forward, fingers trembling, and snatched the memo. He scanned the first lines, his face draining of color. No, he whispered. No, this isn't right. But it was. Every word carved into that page was a truth no amount of denial could erase. David watched him carefully. He had expected anger, but what unfolded was something more complex. Charles stumbled back into a chair, staring at the document as if it were a venomous snake poised to strike. My father wouldn't. His voice broke. He wouldn't do this. David didn't respond. He let the silence speak. Charles read further. Each subsequent sentence tightened around him like a noose. When he finished, he slammed the paper onto the table, breathing hard. This is fabricated, he said abruptly. It has to be. Someone planted this. It's your father's signature, David said quietly. Forged, Charles snapped. The supporting documents. Fake, he insisted. The dates, David added softly, match perfectly with the timeline of the committee investigation. The references line up with case numbers. Stop, Charles roared. His voice reverberated off the walls. His breath came in ragged bursts. His face contorted in a mixture of fury, disbelief, and grief. David kept his expression neutral. Empathy flickered in his chest, but it didn't soften his clarity. This was a man confronting a truth heavy enough to crack foundations. Charles pressed his hands to his face, elbows on his knees, shoulders trembling. For a moment, he looked not like a titan of law but like a lost boy, forced to see a version of his father he had never imagined. When he finally lowered his hands, his eyes were sharp again, but something in them had changed. Something darker now lived behind the irises. Who else knows about this? Charles asked. David felt every muscle in his body stiffen. Only me, he said, and Harold to some extent. And now you. And the person who stored this in the archives. David hesitated. Charles leaned forward. Predator scenting hidden prey. Ross, who else knows? David's voice lowered. The woman who worked here for almost 50 years. The typist, Mrs. Hayes. Charles went still. Her. The word was almost spat. Of course. David tried to read his face, his posture, the warning signals flickering under the surface of his expression. Something cold twisted in Charles's gaze now. Less fear, more calculation. She hid this, Charles said softly, dangerously. She hid this for decades. She preserved it, David corrected gently. She sabotaged us. She protected the truth. Charles stood suddenly, so fast his chair skidded backward. He paced to the opposite wall, running a hand through his hair. That old woman, he muttered. I knew she was trouble, always looking at me with those knowing eyes. Did she think she was a guardian of justice or something? David didn't answer. Eleanor's quiet presence filled his mind. Her steady fingers, her calm voice, her careful warning. She had known this moment would come, a moment where truth and power collided on a collision course. Charles turned sharply. Where is she now? Home, David said. And does she have any other copies? David paused. Charles caught it immediately. What aren't you telling me? David breathed out slowly. She typed a copy back then. Clean one. Just in case something happened to the original. Charles's face drained of color again. A second copy. I don't know where it is, David admitted. She didn't say. Charles's jaw tightened. She's a liability. David's blood chilled. No, he said firmly. She's a witness. And she's the one who kept the truth from being lost. Charles walked toward him, steps slow, predatory. Tell me where she lives. David straightened, tension coiling inside him. No. Charles's face twisted. You forget yourself, Ross. I am your superior. With respect, David replied. I think you've forgotten what the law means. Charles's nostrils flared. Rage flickered across his features like lightning. For a fraction of a second, David thought the man might hit him. But instead, Charles turned away, grabbing the memo from the table and clutching it tightly, as though afraid it might dissolve if he let go. We're taking this to the judge, he said through clenched teeth. Right now. David exhaled, relieved the moment hadn't turned violent. But as they left the room, walking toward the elevator where a handful of partners were already gathering in hurried anticipation, David felt the weight of something else pressing down on him. Something heavy, something unspoken. Charles's desperation was dangerous. Dangerous men made dangerous decisions. And Eleanor Hayes, gentle, quiet, overlooked Eleanor, now stood directly in the trajectory of a man fighting for his legacy, his father's memory, and his empire. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. As Charles stepped inside, memo in hand, face pale and eyes blazing, David couldn't shake the feeling that someone, maybe everyone, was about to step into a courtroom not just filled with lawyers and a judge but with ghosts. Ghosts of lies, ghosts of ambition, ghosts of a truth buried for half a century, now clawing its way back into daylight. The doors slid shut, and as the elevator descended, David finally understood why Eleanor had said the truth was heavier than he thought. The elevator hummed as it descended, a low mechanical vibration that seemed to echo inside David's bones. He stood beside Charles, who held the memo in a white-knuckled grip. His jaw set so tightly it looked carved from granite. The early morning light filtering through the elevator's narrow window cast a thin, ghostly strip across his face, illuminating the tension etched into every line. Behind them, Harold and two other partners whispered among themselves, their voices urgent but hushed, as though afraid the elevator itself might be listening. David stared at the floor numbers blinking slowly downward, 23, 22, 21. Each passing digit tightening something inside him. The truth was out of the box now, traveling with them toward a courtroom already trembling with anticipation. But what lay ahead wasn't just a legal battle. It was a collision between history, legacy, and the fragile scaffolding of lies that had held the firm aloft for decades. When the elevator doors slid open into the underground parking garage, cold air rushed in, smelling of concrete, motor oil, and the faint metallic tang of early morning dampness. The partners strode out first, their polished shoes clicking sharply on the cement floor. Charles walked with quick, hard steps, refusing to look at anyone. David followed with measured pace, his senses heightened, every instinct on edge. A small convoy waited for them, Black sedans with tinted windows, the kind used by high-profile lawyers when discretion and speed were essential. Harold gestured toward the lead car, and everyone climbed in with the urgency of men stepping into a battlefield rather than a vehicle. David found himself in the back seat with Charles and another senior partner. The driver, a stone-faced staffer with years of experience in crisis transport, pulled out of the garage and accelerated into the foggy pre-dawn streets. Chicago looked muted in the gray morning light, skyscrapers rising as dark silhouettes against a sky that hadn't decided whether it wanted to dawn or collapse back into night. The streets were mostly empty at this hour, offering the convoy a rare, unobstructed path toward the courthouse. But inside the car, tension clung to the air like static electricity. Charles stared straight ahead, his knuckles still locked around the memo. David could see the paper trembling slightly. Whether it was from fear or anger, he couldn't tell. "You're quiet," Charles said suddenly, eyes still fixed on the road. David hesitated. "I'm thinking." "About what?" "About what happens after the judge sees this." Charles let out a brittle, humorless laugh. "After the judge sees this, Ross, my life is over. The firm's reputation will crumble. Opposing counsel will celebrate a career-making victory, and my father will be remembered as a fraud. What do you think I'm thinking about?" David looked out the window as the city blurred by. "Your father's choices aren't your fault." Charles finally turned toward him, eyes burning with a mix of desperation and something darker. "Don't patronize me. You think I didn't know he was ruthless? You think I didn't suspect he cut corners? But this memo makes him a criminal. It makes everything he built tainted. It makes everything I inherited." His voice cracked, then hardened. "A lie." David held his gaze. "Maybe the truth was always meant to come out." "That's easy for you to say," Charles snapped. "You didn't grow up with him. You didn't spend your entire life proving you deserved to carry his name." David didn't respond. He didn't know what it meant to inherit not just power, but the burden of a father's shadow. The car fell back into silence, punctuated only by the muted thrum of the tires on wet asphalt. As they neared the courthouse, they saw the media already gathering. Cameras, reporters, microphone-wielding silhouettes waiting like vultures for the first whiff of scandal. The convoy pulled into a private underground entryway, avoiding the frenzy on the street. Security ushered them into a restricted hallway, their footsteps echoing sharply off the marble floors. Inside the courthouse, the air felt heavy, almost reverent, like a church built for judgment instead of prayer. Attorneys hurried between rooms, faces drawn tight with the weight of their own battles. The hearing room they entered was smaller than the firm's towering conference spaces, but held a gravity none of those rooms could match. As they walked in, opposing counsel, led by the sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued Amelia Grant, stood near the judge's bench, arms crossed, posture exuding the confidence of someone who smelled blood. Well, she murmured, eyes landing on Charles. "I wasn't sure you'd show. Thought you might be too busy destroying evidence." Charles stiffened, and Harold shot him a warning look. Judge Sinclair entered moments later, robes flowing behind her like a curtain of midnight. She was a woman known for her stern fairness, someone who despised theatrics and loathed deception. As everyone took their seats, she peered over her glasses, eyes sharp as honed steel. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I trust you have brought the memo this court requested." Charles opened his mouth, but David stepped forward before he could speak. He reached into the box he'd carried, removed the memo with the care of someone handling an artifact from a museum, and approached the bench. "Your Honor," he said, projecting calm even though his pulse hammered beneath his skin. "This is the original 1974 memo." Judge Sinclair gestured for the bailiff to retrieve it. She adjusted her glasses, leaning forward to read the first page. The courtroom held its breath. With each line she read, her face grew grimmer. "This," she said eventually, "is highly incriminating." A hush fell over the room. Even Amelia Grant seemed momentarily startled by the completeness of the document. The precision, the damning clarity. "Mr. Whitmore," the judge said evenly, "are you aware of the implications of this memo?" Charles stood slowly, as if the weight of the air itself pushed him down. "Your Honor," he began, voice strained. I had no knowledge of this document until this morning." "That is convenient," Amelia Grant interjected. Judge Sinclair shot her a cold look. "Ms. Grant, you will wait your turn." Amelia pressed her lips together, but her eyes glinted with satisfaction. The judge returned her attention to Charles. "Your father, Arthur Whitmore, knowingly concealed financial improprieties. According to this memo, he intended to mislead regulatory committees. This is not a matter that affects only your firm. It affects the integrity of cases and clients spanning decades." David watched Charles closely. Beneath the indignation and fear, something else flickered. A small, flickering ember of shame. He wasn't defending his father out of loyalty alone. He was defending the version of himself that had been built on his father's pedestal. "Your Honor," Harold interjected, stepping up with practiced diplomacy. "We intend to cooperate fully with the court's review. We have nothing to hide." "Let us hope that is true," Judge Sinclair replied. She set the memo down with deliberate care. "This court will grant a recess until noon. By that time, I expect a complete accounting of all relevant materials in your possession." With a sharp crack of her gavel, the hearing adjourned. As people rose from their seats, reporters surged toward the doors, eager to spread the morning's explosive revelation. Amelia Grant approached David, her expression a mix of professional respect and predatory curiosity. "You're new," she said, bold move stepping forward instead of letting your boss handle it. David managed a polite nod. "I simply presented the evidence." She murmured, stepping closer, lowering her voice. "Someone like you should be careful in that firm. Truth has a way of putting targets on people's backs." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, heels echoing sharply toward the exit. David felt a chill creep through him. Her warning wasn't idle. It was a prediction. As the courtroom emptied, Charles approached him, expression unreadable. "Where did you say you found this memo?" he asked. "In the archive room," David replied. "Exactly where Mrs. Hayes said it would be." Charles stared at him for a long moment, eyes darkening. "That woman," he said quietly, "is more dangerous than she looks." David felt his heartbeat spike. "She didn't create the truth, sir. She only kept it safe." Charles stepped closer, lowering his voice to a razor-thin whisper. "You don't understand. My father trusted her. She was there longer than anyone. If she kept a copy..." David's stomach tightened. "She did." Charles froze. "She may still have it," David continued carefully. "She didn't say where." Charles's expression twisted into something sharp and sinister. "We need to get ahead of this." David stiffened. "What do you mean?" But Charles didn't answer. He turned abruptly, striding away with the urgency of a man forming a plan. One that made David's skin crawl. Harold approached him after Charles left the room, his voice low. "You need to keep your guard up, Ross. You did the right thing bringing the memo. But Charles, he's unraveling." David nodded slowly. "I know. Be careful what you reveal to him," Harold warned. "When powerful men fall, they tend to grab onto anyone on their way down." That warning settled heavily on David's shoulders. As he left the courthouse, he felt the city's morning noise swell around him. Cars honking, crowds gathering, voices rising. But beneath it all, he sensed the shift, the turning point. The truth was no longer trapped in shadows. It had stepped into daylight. And daylight was where the most dangerous things happened. Because now Charles Whitmore knew the truth. And he knew who had kept it hidden. And he knew who had brought it back into the light. David looked toward the horizon, where the sun finally broke through the clouds in thin, hesitant rays. He wondered what Eleanor was doing at that moment. If she sensed the storm moving toward her door, if she felt the tremor running through the city. He knew one thing. The truth wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The morning sun had finally breached the skyline by the time David reached the sidewalk outside the courthouse. But its light felt thin, brittle, as if even the sun was hesitant to shine too brightly on the truth that had just been dragged into the open. The city stirred with increasing noise, horns, heels on pavement, the faint rumble of the elevated train nearby. But beneath it all, a different kind of tension hummed, a current running through David's nerves like cold electricity. He stayed on the courthouse steps for a moment, unable to shake the weight lodged in his chest. Charles's final look, dark, calculating, threaded with desperation, lingered in his mind like a bruise that refused to fade. The memo had been handed over, the judge had seen it, and the legal machinery was now grinding forward. But something was wrong. Something in the way Charles spoke, the way his voice thinned to a whisper like a man cornered by ghosts he couldn't outrun. It told David the storm wasn't over. It was barely beginning. A small gust of wind swept across the steps, tugging at David's coat and sending the last drops of morning rain dripping from the railing. He inhaled deeply, trying to clear the fog of unease clouding his thoughts. He needed to think. He needed to plan. And most of all, he needed to check on Eleanor. His phone vibrated. He pulled it out, expecting Harold. Instead, the screen displayed an unfamiliar number. Panic flickered in his chest. Had Charles already made a move? Had he? But when he answered, the voice on the other end was trembling. "Mr. Ross? It's Lena, from the front desk." He recognized her immediately. Lena was soft-spoken but observant, the kind of person who noticed every face, every shift in tone, every subtle change in a room's temperature. "Lena? What's wrong?" I thought you should know," she stammered, her breath shaky. "Mr. Whitmore came through the lobby an hour ago, right after you all left for court. He was different, very different." David's grip tightened. "How?" He was shaking, angry, kept muttering under his breath. "I couldn't hear everything, but I caught a few words." He waited. "Your name," she whispered. And Mrs. Hayes's." David stopped walking. His heart dropped low, heavy. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Lena said. "He said something like, 'She's responsible for this, and I won't let her destroy everything.' And when he left, he said he needed to settle an old debt." A tremor ran through David's spine. He forced himself to stay calm. Did he say where he was going? No, but he grabbed his coat and left through the lower exit. He looked determined, focused, in a very frightening way. David closed his eyes, exhaling through clenched teeth. "Thank you, Lena. You did the right thing calling me." "Please be careful," she whispered. "I don't like how he looked." The line went dead. David pocketed the phone and stood still, staring blindly at the bustling sidewalk. Charles Whitmore, cornered, humiliated, desperate, was now a man possessed. The kind of man who might convince himself that eliminating the source of the truth could erase the consequences. The kind of man who might believe that if he struck quickly enough, the past could be buried again, permanently. And Eleanor Hayes, the woman who had spent half a century preserving truth with quiet dignity, was now in his path. David felt something shift inside him, a tightening like a hand closing around his ribcage. He flagged down a cab with a sharp wave, climbed inside, and gave the driver Eleanor's address. The car pulled into traffic with a lurch. As the city blurred past him, David replayed every detail of his conversation with her the night before. The calm in her voice, the acceptance in her tone, the years etched into every soft drawn breath. She had known, even then, that helping him would place her back in the crosshairs of a man who saw truth as a threat instead of a foundation. He wished he had pressed her for more. About the copy she mentioned. About the reason she had kept it. About why she had preserved something that could crush the very place she had served so faithfully. But she had guarded her secrets with the same care she used to guard the firm's files. Patient, precise, and with a wisdom that came from watching powerful men rise and fall through decades of shifting corporate wars. The cab slowed as it turned into her neighborhood, an older part of the city, lined with small brick buildings, aging trees arching overhead, casting long shadows across narrow sidewalks. Her building stood quietly at the corner, a modest three-story structure with chipping paint and flower boxes filled with early blooming geraniums. It was peaceful. That's what terrified him. He paid the driver quickly and stepped out, scanning the street. No black sedan. No sign of Charles. But that didn't mean anything. He could already be inside. David climbed the steps 2 at a time and knocked sharply on Eleanor's door. "Mrs. Hayes," he called. "It's David. Are you?" The door opened before he finished. Eleanor stood there, wrapped in a soft gray sweater, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun. She looked calm, composed, as though she'd been expecting him. "Come in, David," she said with a tired smile. "I made tea." He stepped inside, his nerves buzzing. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm glad you're safe. I came as fast as I could. I think Charles might." "I know," she said gently. "You know?" She nodded. "Harold called me before the hearing started. He warned me Charles was unraveling." David blinked. "Harold called you?" "Yes. He's always been a decent man, beneath the corporate armor. He thought I should be warned." She walked toward the small kitchen, her movements steady and unhurried. "There. I find it helps steady the nerves." "Mrs. Hayes, Eleanor, this is serious. He's not thinking clearly. He could hurt me." She let out a quiet laugh, not unkind, but with a depth of sadness. "Oh, David, men like Charles always lash out when the world stops bending around them. I've seen it more times than I can count." She poured tea into 2 ceramic cups, decorated with faded blue patterns. "Sit. You look like you're about to collapse." He sat reluctantly, eyes scanning the living room. It was filled with papers, neatly stacked on bookshelves, a few framed photographs, and in the corner, her Remington typewriter resting atop a wooden desk like an old friend guarding the room. "I found the memo," David said after a moment. "Just where you said. I knew you would. And the copy you mentioned. Do you still have it?" She paused, teacup midair. "Yes," she said softly. "But it's not here." David leaned forward. "Where is it?" "In a place Charles would never think to look," she replied. Her eyes twinkled with a quiet, weary humor. "And a place he cannot touch." David exhaled slowly. Relief, curiosity, and dread twisted together in his chest. "Why keep a second copy?" Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window, where weak sunlight filtered through worn curtains. "Because I knew one day the truth would be needed. Because evidence has a way of disappearing in the hands of powerful men. And because the law, which I devoted my entire life to supporting, should never be at the mercy of one corrupt soul." She looked back at him. "Even if that soul has a familiar name." Before David could respond, a sudden knock resounded through the door, loud, sharp, and jarring in the quiet apartment. Eleanor's eyes softened. "He's here." David shot to his feet. His pulse surged. "I'll deal with him." "You'll do no such thing," Eleanor said gently but firmly. "Sit." Another knock, harder, more impatient. Eleanor set down her tea with steady hands and walked to the door. David watched, every muscle tensed, ready to intervene. She opened the door. Charles Whitmore stood on the threshold. He looked nothing like the man who had stepped into the courthouse hours earlier. His hair was disheveled, his tie crooked, his coat half-buttoned. His eyes, once sharp and predatory, now gleamed with desperation and something close to madness. "Eleanor," he breathed, voice tight. "We need to talk." She tilted her head slightly. "About your father? Or about the mess you've made trying to protect him?" Charles stiffened. "Let me in." "No." His jaw clenched. "I'm not asking." "You never ask," she said quietly. "You demand. Like your father." Charles's eyes flicked past her and landed on David. Something dark flared in them, something territorial, dangerous. "You brought him here?" Charles snarled. "I invited him," Eleanor replied calmly. "Because unlike you, David seeks the truth, not its destruction." Charles stepped inside without waiting for permission, looming too large in the small living room. The air thickened instantly, heavy with old resentment and new rage. "You think you can ruin me," he said to Eleanor, voice cracking. "You think you can expose my father and tear down everything he built." Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. "Your father destroyed himself. I simply refused to burn the evidence." "You owed him loyalty." "I owed the law my truth," she countered. And I owed myself my conscience. Something inside Charles snapped then. David could see it. A man losing his grip on the last frayed string of control. You're not going to walk away from this, Charles whispered. Not after what you did. Eleanor straightened, her frail frame somehow radiating strength. I walked toward the truth. You've spent your whole life running from it. Charles's hand twitched. David moved before he could think, stepping between them. Back away, David said, voice low, steady. Charles's eyes thinned to slits. You brought that memo into the light. You made this worse. David held his ground. The truth was always there. You were just afraid to see it. Charles lunged. But before he reached David, Eleanor spoke again, her voice cutting through the air like a bell. Arthur trusted me, she said. Charles froze. He trusted me? Eleanor repeated. More than he trusted you. Charles's face twisted. Pain, fury, jealousy, shame, all colliding at once. He asked me, she continued, to type more than you will ever know. He asked my opinion on things he never shared with you. He confided in me about the fear of losing his empire. He told me once that you were too rigid, too desperate to please him. Stop, Charles whispered, trembling. But the one thing he never expected, Eleanor said softly, was that I would save the truth he tried to bury. Charles staggered back, as if her words struck him harder than any physical blow. He sank into the nearest chair, face in his hands. I did everything for him, Charles whispered, voice breaking. Everything. I know, Eleanor said gently. But your loyalty blinded you. Silence filled the room. Thick, painful, trembling. David watched Charles with a strange mix of pity and caution. Charles wasn't merely angry. He was unraveling under the weight of betrayal he never expected to face. A lifetime of worshipping a man who built his empire on deceit, now crumbling around him. After a long moment, Charles lifted his head. His eyes were red, haunted. Where's the second copy? He asked. His voice was no longer threatening. It was pleading. Eleanor stepped closer, not afraid. Safe, she said. And you cannot destroy it. Not in this lifetime. Charles inhaled a shaky breath. Then it's over. It's not over, Eleanor replied, her voice softer than before. It's beginning. David sensed a shift, a turning of the tide. Charles wasn't defeated. Not yet. His next move would be the most dangerous because it would be his last attempt to regain control. But Eleanor Hayes, she was unshaken. Her presence in the room, small and steady, felt like the anchor that kept the truth from drifting back into darkness. Charles rose slowly, his movements deliberate. He looked at Eleanor, truly looked, as though seeing her for the first time not as an old typist, not as a relic, not as an obstacle, but as the woman who held the keys to the empire he'd grown up trying to inherit. You ruined everything, he whispered. Not with anger now, but grief. Eleanor shook her head. No, Charles. I saved you from living a lie. He stared at her a moment longer, chest heaving. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the apartment. The door clicked shut behind him. The building fell into silence. David exhaled shakily. Are you okay? Eleanor nodded. I've faced worse men, she said. He stared at her, still stunned. What now? The silence left behind after Charles walked out lingered in Eleanor's apartment like dust in a sunbeam, soft, suspended, yet impossibly heavy. David stood near the doorway, still catching his breath, still feeling the adrenaline trapped like static beneath his skin. Eleanor moved quietly back toward the small kitchen, lifting her cup of tea as if nothing monumental had happened. Her hand trembled, but only barely. She steadied it with the other hand, inhaling the warm steam, letting the air fill the room again. He won't accept this, David said finally, breaking the fragile quiet. He's shaken, not defeated. You saw the way he looked at you at the memo. He's not done. Eleanor nodded slowly. I know, but he's reached the point every powerful man reaches eventually. What point is that? The moment he must stop running from the truth. because the truth refuses to run from him. David watched her for a moment, then sat beside her at the small wooden table. The apartment felt like another world. One far removed from the towering glass firm, far removed from the courtroom, far removed from the battles that had defined the morning. Here, the air was warm and smelled faintly of tea leaves and worn books. Here, the truth felt less like a dagger and more like a promise. There was a soft knock on the window. David jolted upright before realizing it was just the wind brushing a loose branch against the glass. Eleanor didn't even glance over. "I'm sorry," he said, exhaling. "I'm still on edge." "That's because your heart is too young to accept that some storms are meant to be weathered, not outrun," Eleanor said, a faint smile touching her lips. He studied her, her silver hair glowing softly under the lamplight, her serene face etched with the quiet wisdom of a life lived in shadows of justice and secrecy. She looked fragile on the outside, but inside, she was built of steel. A one-woman archive of truths no one else had the courage to preserve. "Eleanor," he said softly, "you really think this ends well?" She took a long, thoughtful sip of tea. "Not for Charles, but for the truth? Yes. It always ends well for the truth, eventually. It just takes the rest of us time to catch up." David leaned back in his chair, letting her words sink into him. They stayed like that for a few minutes, two generations separated by decades but bound by something deeper. The moment where truth demanded to be known. Then Eleanor spoke again, her voice lower, softer. "David, there's something you should have." She rose slowly, crossing the apartment to the old wooden desk by the window. She pulled open the bottom drawer, the one that creaked softly, as though it hadn't been opened in years. Inside lay a small, leather-bound journal. She returned and placed it gently in front of him. "What is this?" he asked, running his fingers across the cracked leather. "My record," she said simply. "Every case I typed, every memo I handled, every discrepancy, every contradiction, every shadow that had no business being there." "You kept all this?" "For decades," she said, "because someone had to, and because one day someone like you would come along. Someone who hadn't yet been corrupted by ambition, or fear, or misplaced loyalty." David opened the journal and saw neat handwriting. Elegant, deliberate, written with the same precision Eleanor used on her typewriter. Every page was a testament to the truth she had safeguarded. "This could expose so much more," he whispered. "Yes," she said, "but it should not be used for destruction, only for justice. Promise me you'll remember that." He looked into her eyes and nodded. "I promise." The doorbell rang, interrupting the moment. David stiffened. "Stay here," he whispered, his pulse spiking. But when he opened the door, it wasn't Charles. It was Harold. He stood in the hallway, rain on his coat, exhaustion in his eyes. But there was a softness, a humility David had never seen in him before. "David," Harold said quietly. "Mrs. Hayes." Eleanor smiled politely. "Come in, Harold." He stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. "I wanted to check on both of you," he said, "and to tell you something important." David motioned for him to sit. Harold remained standing. "The judge called me after the recess," Harold began. "She wants full transparency, full cooperation. She said if we surrender everything voluntarily, she'll consider leniency toward the firm." He hesitated. "But Charles refused." Eleanor sighed. "Of course he did." Harold removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "He's gone to the board. He's trying to convince them you manipulated the memo, Ross, that you found forged documents, that Mrs. Hayes orchestrated some vendetta." David felt his blood run cold. Eleanor's expression remained calm. "He is panicking. The more he panics, the more truth reveals itself." Harold nodded slowly. "I think he's spiraling, and I think he's dangerous right now." David glanced at Eleanor. She nodded slightly. She had known all this was coming. "What do we do?" David asked. Harold's voice softened. "You both stay out of sight today. The firm is a tinderbox. One spark and it'll all burn." He turned to Eleanor. And I want you to know something. You were right all those years. We all relied too much on technology, on speed, on convenience. But you preserved the soul of the firm. And I'm sorry that men like Charles forgot that. For the first time, Eleanor's composure wavered. Her eyes glistened. Thank you, Harold, she said quietly. He squeezed her shoulder gently. I'll handle the board. I'll tell the judge we're cooperating fully. And David, prepare yourself. For what? David asked. For becoming the firm's moral compass, Harold said with a faint smile. Someone has to be. He left with a final nod, disappearing down the hallway. The apartment grew silent again. David let out a long breath. Eleanor, I don't know if I'm ready for that. Of course you're not, she said. No one ever is. But you will be. He looked at her, really looked, and saw everything she had carried her entire life. Quietly, faithfully, without applause or recognition. She had held together a world that didn't even realize it needed her. You should rest, he said. She shook her head gently. No, I've rested long enough. It's time. For what? She walked to the window again, gazing out at the street where sunlight finally pierced through the morning gloom. For me, she said softly. To let go. David didn't understand at first. Let go? She smiled. A soft, bittersweet smile. David, I'm tired. I've carried 50 years of truth in my hands. And now I've placed it in yours. He swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. I'm not leaving this world angry, she continued. I'm leaving it knowing that one young man with a good heart came along exactly when he was needed. Eleanor, don't talk like that. She reached out, placing her hand over his. Her skin was soft, thin, warm. Every person, she said, has one final task. Mine was to deliver the truth. Yours is to carry it forward. His vision blurred. I'll try. I'll do my best. She squeezed his hand. I know. That's why I chose you. A quiet warmth spread through the room as she sat back, closing her eyes briefly, as if savoring the release of a burden she had carried alone for far too long. Outside, the city stirred toward noon. Inside, an old typist finally laid down her invisible armor. And in that moment, David felt something shift. Not just in the room, not just in himself, but in the world. Something long buried had been unearthed. Something long silenced had been spoken. Something long overshadowed had finally stepped into the light. Eleanor exhaled slowly, opening her eyes again with a serene calm. It's time for you to go, she said gently. The judge will be waiting, and the world needs to hear your voice now. David nodded, rising to his feet. I'll come back after the hearing, she smiled. I'll be here. He walked to the door, pausing to look back one last time. Eleanor Hayes sat quietly at her table, steam rising from her forgotten cup of tea, her Remington waiting patiently in the corner like an old friend. She looked peaceful, lighter than he had ever seen her. Thank you, Eleanor, he whispered. She nodded. Go, David. Tell the truth. He stepped out into the hallway, closing the door softly behind him. The latch clicked with a gentle finality. As David descended the stairs and walked into the brightening day, he didn't feel alone. Her presence followed him, quiet and steady, like the echo of typewriter keys still striking truths into the universe. He walked toward the courthouse, toward the future, toward whatever battles awaited him. And upstairs, in her small, sunlit apartment, Eleanor Hayes sat still for a moment longer, smiling to herself, breathing in the warmth, letting her tired heart rest. The truth was free, and finally so was she.